What's going on, guys? Today is the first day of Joe Rogan week.
Welcome.
We thought since he's doing so much like health related stuff lately, there's two big podcasts. We've only gotten to the first one. Today is the review of that podcast.
Yes.
The first one is Kresser versus Dr. Joel Kahn.
So Chris Kresser was a vegan vegetarian, but he's currently on the paleo diet, and Dr. Joel Kahn is a vegan.
For 42 years.
47.
47?
40 plus years.
We both watched the podcast independently, took notes, gave our thoughts, and here we are. So I'll link the full podcast down below. It's like 4 hours long. You guys should check that out because this is just like our quick reviews of like the hot topics of it. Each participant has like a full website with all their sources, but I tried reading through all those. It's very difficult to find which source actually aligns with which point they're trying to make. So I'll link both their websites below also. You can check out all the studies and stuff.
And then I didn't look at any of the studies or the sources. I just went off what they said in the podcast.
So what's your overall take on the podcast first?
It was well presented on both of their parts. I think Dr. Joel Kahn's a better speaker. So I think that gives him just like a little up because he presented it more just, energetically, I would say. But I think overall, Chris Kresser came with the newest, the most relevant data and science, which is what swayed me.
I think that's a good summary. So the first, I think, important topic they touched on was basically what studies are valid, what studies should be ignored, or like how you should weight the different studies.
Yes.
A lot of vegan arguments stem from epidemiological data, which is like, this group of people lives longer than this group of people. And Chris Kresser does a really good job of debunking all of that.
The relative risks in nutrition are so low that they're indistinguishable from chance. So in fields outside of nutrition and epidemiology, nobody would consider a relative risk, an increase in risk less than 100%, a doubling, to be really worth paying attention to. So to put this in perspective, the observational studies that Joel was referring to that confirm that cigarette smoking led to lung cancer, that showed between a 1,000 and 3,000% increase in lung cancer in smokers, okay? And the studies that have shown that eating aflatoxin, which is a mycotoxin, increased liver cancer risk, that's 600% increase. Okay, the IARC, the WHO report that suggested that processed red meat was a carcinogen, that was 18% increase. Most epidemiologists you talk to will say that is so low that it's really indistinguishable from chance.
Okay, so basically Chris Kresser is presenting that the figure that you'll find, like if you watch that film, What the Health, the figure the whole thing is based on, red meat causes cancer, or meat in general causes cancer. Eating one egg is as bad as smoking a cigarette or a pack of cigarettes. 5 cigarettes. That's all based on this 18% value, which Chris Kresser is arguing is indistinguishable from chance. This is just like an epidemiological hypothesis. Like once you have this, okay, there's a decent chance, 18%, let's put this to an actual like scientific test. He then goes on to talk about how other things have epidemiologically pointed towards one outcome, but then when it's actually tested in a lab, it's like the exact opposite of what they thought.
And then what's also interesting is that he brings up the healthy user bias. So at first I didn't know what he meant at all. So I didn't know the wording for this, but
right. Healthy user bias is what it's called.
Right. So that essentially means that meat eaters also could be smoking higher. They could be not active, they're overweight to begin with. And so all these other factors also come into play that increase the risk of cancer, not just the meat. So the issue with epidemiological studies is that we're not isolating just the meat. We're taking all these factors, but then saying that it's the meat's fault and not the overweight, not the inactive, not the smoking, not the other, all the other things.
Unhealthy people over the past 50 years have eaten more red meat because the government has been saying not to eat red meat because it causes cancer, So that is already self-selecting for unhealthier people. Those people, the ones that are eating higher processed, and it's not even red meat, it's processed meats.
Right.
So the people eating higher amounts of processed meats are also smoking more, they're also less active. And then when you get like samples of vegans to compare to, of course the vegans live longer because they're also healthier people. So we're going to get to it in a second, but within 20 minutes of the podcast, which I would expect every vegan proponent to do, he brings up the Seventh-day Adventist. Once again, it's comparing vegans to People that sit on the couch all day. So yeah, the vegans live longer. So the vegans live super long compared to standard American diets. But I would say Chris Kresser's basic point throughout the entire podcast is vegans are living longer because they're removing all of the bad stuff from a standard American diet. But let's say you take a vegan, you add nutrient-dense animal foods. Is that better or worse than a vegan diet? And the answer is it's better because it's way more nutrient-dense. He gets to this in the end.
There are studies that showed.
Yeah, so onward.
If we throw epidemiology away, we've thrown away about 80% of nutrition knowledge because that is the most common kind of study. And that still leaves us with basic science, which is rockin'. It leaves us with randomized clinical trials, which are very hard in nutrition, and they're very expensive, and there's less than we need. And it finally leaves us with studying old, healthy people, centenarian studies. We'll just go to Loma Linda. 10 times more people in Loma Linda are over 100 than there are in Los Angeles. 10 times more. That's by definition. Yeah, it's called the blue zone. And
Okay, so the best way to address that is exactly the way Chris Kresser addresses it. But these vegans, they love the blue zones. They love like these small societies of people that are eating a vegan diet, but they're also exercising. They're also like have a good sense of community. Mm-hmm. That's like a huge factor in how long you live is like, are you chatting with people every day? Do you have a bunch of friends? That matters a lot. And all of those are also aligned for the people in Loma Linda.
But there's no observational studies with significant numbers of paleo dieters, Joel.
Oh, I know that.
So the healthy user bias is not an issue for paleo
but
people.
If you don't have data,
studies.
doesn't mean, you don't have data because it's a new movement that hasn't had the data, but it's not to cast stones that plant-based eaters go to the gym more. It's probably true. We don't know, but
the basic problem is that there's a ton of societies that just eat vegan diets now. I guess like Loma Linda is a big one that most vegans will reference, but there is no society of people that just eats healthy foods, including animals. So there's no like data to reference against. It's just vegans versus the people that are making no dietary decision whatsoever. It's just like if it's in front of them, they eat it. So of course the vegans live longer.
I do want to say like one thing, that both of the individuals, Dr. Joel Kahn and Chris Kresser, practice functional medicine. So it's not all about pushing pills. It's about how your sleep is, your relationships, and how you communicate with others. So there's a lot more that goes into it, and food is just one part. And I also think it was interesting that Joel Kahn talks a lot about the 4 points. So it's not just epidemiological studies, it's the basic science, biochemistry.
There is other points, and then I think he throws in the centenarian studies. Like that's not one of the pillars of science. He's just like doing that because it makes his point true.
But there's a lot of old people though. So studying that population makes somewhat sense.
It does make sense, but there's no old people that have been doing a paleo diet for 60 years. There's very few because it hasn't really been
It's a newer movement.
It's a newer movement.
As he mentioned.
But it's kind of cherry picking. Like going to the centenarians, a lot of them are vegans because they're not eating all of the bad things in the American diet.
Dr. Joel Kahn thinks it's reasonable to make a conclusion based on the 4 I just mentioned, right? Basic, epidemiological, centenarian, and then randomized controlled trials. So those 4, you can make the conclusion, vegan's better. Chris Kresser's big thing is that, his big thing is just focusing on the epidemiological, so that data collection's an issue, because the way you create an epidemiological study is to get questionnaires from people. So unhealthy people are not going to answer truthfully, right? They're going to be like, I don't want to say how much I weigh or how inactive I am or that I smoke a pack a day.
Because everyone underreports how much food they eat.
Exactly. So things are underreported. So
but epidemiological studies aren't only food journals. It's also like country versus country. Like Japan, they eat a lot of rice. Whereas like Kenya, they eat a lot of meat. So you can just cross-reference those things. But then there's a lot of other environmental factors that play into it.
Questioning the questionnaires by the individuals, he brings up the healthy user bias, as we talked about. And then the other big point, as we mentioned, is the low increase. So it's indistinguishable from chance, like the 18% versus the 3,000% in what actually contributes to cancer, lung cancer.
if you were an animal protein eater, that's called meat, you had a 300 to 400% increase in cancer risk. 300 to 400%, that's 3 to 4 times, isn't 1.1, 1.08, 18%. The data's there. This is peer-reviewed data.
Okay, so this study he's referencing, it's hard to really figure out exactly what study they're referencing all the time, but this one is like pretty central to Dr. Joel Kahn's point. And it's not a study on animal protein versus vegan protein intake at all. So like relying on this study to prove that animal protein causes more cancer than vegan protein protein isn't like logically consistent in my opinion. So I'll link this study below. If you actually read what they say, the sample size of the study had a mean age of 65 years old, representative of the US population in ethnicity, education, and health characteristics. So it's old people already. The study starts at age 65. The whole study was not animal versus vegan protein. It was about amount of protein. It's a little bit disingenuous in my opinion what Dr. Joel Kahn is doing here, because we've just done like a 45-minute talk about what kind of data we're willing to accept and what we're not. And then he brings in this study and he's like, look, the science is right here, man. Look at the science. And then you look at the science and it's like, the limitations of the study, which should be acknowledged. First, the use of a single 24-hour dietary recall followed up by 18 years of mortality assessment. So that's how they did the study. They have you do a 1-day, 24-hour food diary, and then they follow up 18 years afterwards, your mortality rate. Does that seem like a good study to you guys? Is that what we should be like writing food guidelines on? A 24-hour food diary and 18 years of follow-up?
Up, yeah.
It's
not
just
the
dumb.
entire 18 years, just 18 years post,
Like,
right?
look at the studies Dr. Joel Kahn's referencing, and then look at the studies from like 2017 that Kresser is referencing, like actual double-blind placebo, like smart shopper studies. It's very clear which data should be trusted and which shouldn't. Does Dr. Joel Kahn believe that study is what you should be basing recommendations on? I don't think so.
You can design an observational study
Sure.
in a way that controls for some of these potentially confounding factors like the healthy user bias, et cetera. So there are about 8 studies, major studies, that have compared lifespan in vegetarians and vegans and omnivores. So the earlier studies, there are 3 studies that were Seventh-day Adventist studies.
So the Seventh-day Adventist, that's the same thing as the Loma Linda. This is like the vegan hotbed of all research comes from here.
The Seventh-day Adventist community, which Joel mentioned, is a religious group that has as part of its credo, a healthy diet and lifestyle, vegetarian diet, but also live healthy, eat fruits and vegetables, don't smoke, don't drink excessively, etc. So, health conscious group of people. The Seventh-day Adventist study in the Netherlands compared them with the general population, which is just garbage because of the healthy user bias. So we can just cross that one off the list. The 2 Seventh-day Adventist studies that were done in Loma Linda in the US, they did a better job because they compared people who do eat meat amongst the Seventh-day Adventist population with people who don't. And there was a slight advantage in lifespan in the vegetarians versus the meat eaters. But one of those studies didn't control for smoking and body mass index, so that data is highly suspect. And the other study did, and there was a slight advantage. Since then, there have been 4 studies. So they said, let's try to find a group of more health-conscious omnivores to compare these vegetarians against. The first one was called the Health Food Shopper Study. So they looked at people who shop at health food stores, when the idea is people who shop at health food stores are going to be generally more health conscious. And so that study found that both groups, vegetarians and omnivores who shop at health food stores, had a hugely reduced risk of death compared to the general population, but there was no difference between vegetarians and omnivores.
So what Chris Kresser says is extremely valid in contrast to what Dr. Joel Kahn represents. So he's saying that if you take vegetarians or vegans and their omnivore friends and you compare those 2 groups, then there is no difference in lifespan or longevity. That, to me, is an actual representation of comparing vegans to a correct group of people.
So this is one point that I would say throughout the entire podcast, Dr. Joel never really addresses.
Well, he does.
Does he?
And I think he does come back with an argument, and I think it's an extremely weak one. And he says, we try to isolate. When we take epidemiological studies, we try to isolate. There's 21 factors, but we isolate by asking the people. But then again, it's like the people they're underreporting. They're not reporting properly. And then he says 21 health organizations say limit saturated fat,
yes,
not increase. So how could we have gotten all of this wrong? How could there be so many organizations saying one thing, but we're supposed to go against that?
So this is known as an appeal to authority fallacy. Just because the authorities say something doesn't necessarily make it true. And you can't just cite the fact that the authorities recommend it as truth. Throughout the entire podcast, Dr. Joel appeals to authority a lot.
Right, he's relying on the RDA. He's relying on what doctors rely on when they prescribe pills, when they give you recommendations.
Yeah, when the obesity rates are at record highs.
Right.
That's an 18% increase. You can go 4.5% to 5.5%. That's still 50 to 60,000 people a year that get colon cancer if that data's right. They wouldn't get colon cancer if they just would stop eating hot dogs.
So again, this is, in my opinion, Dr. Joel being very logically inconsistent and just like deceptive. So at the start of the podcast, we went over this. We agreed that the 18% is indistinguishable from chance. And then he rephrases it. He's like, oh, it's not 18%. That's actually 50 to 60,000 real Americans. No, it's not 50 to 60,000 real Americans because the 18% that you're basing that number off is indistinguishable from chance. So it's 0 Americans. It could actually be the opposite of that. That's what we just talked about for 45 minutes. Why are you now bringing it up again?
And I'm just thinking of this now that I hear it again. It sounds more like an emotional argument. He's like playing.
He's repackaging it.
Yeah, and saying, and then I'm like, whoa, 50 to 60,000?
Exactly.
That's a lot of people. That could be my mom. That could be my brother.
But let me just give you a few examples of why context is important. So there's evidence that chlorophyll-rich green vegetables prevent myoglobin from being turned into N-nitroso compounds. So if you're eating processed meat, but you're also eating kale and broccoli, then it's not going to have the same effect on the body as if you're just eating a hot dog. Cruciferous vegetables and spices and marinades have been shown to reduce the formation of heterocyclic amines, or HCAs. There are several studies that have shown that eating fruits and vegetables attenuates the oxidative capacity of heme iron and even reduces the absorption of heme iron in the gut. Heme iron intake, really, you can think of it as a proxy for a crappy diet in these observational studies. There's a quote from a study that did find a relationship with heme iron and cardiovascular disease. But the study author himself said, with respect to heme iron intake, we found a significant association only in the studies that were based on American cohorts.
So that's really interesting. And actually, I learned a lot from Chris Kresser during this podcast, because there is certain mechanisms that vegans will propose why meat causes cancer and why meat causes heart disease. And the heme iron content is one of them. Like a vegan argument for heme iron causing heart disease would be just like the amount of heme iron you're consuming in your meats. But actually, it's not that. It's like Chris Kresser just said, it's like a proxy for bad diet. Like people on a standard American diet are going to have way higher heme iron levels than like people eating a paleo diet where they're eating a decent amount of meat, but they're also eating a lot of healthy foods. America has the worst diet in the world. We have like the most processed stuff. So other places where they're having a lot of dietary heme iron, but not a lot of processed foods, there's no correlation between meat consumption and heart disease.
And here's where I think personally that they're just like not really arguing the same thing, because they both agree if you're gonna eat meat, eat it with veggies. That's better for you. Dr. Kahn is constantly comparing vegans to standard Americans, whereas Chris Kresser is trying to bring up the point, well, paleos are not standard Americans. Hot dogs are really bad for you. Yeah, Twinkies are bad for you, but I'm not talking about those people. We're just comparing vegans and paleos, or vegans and healthy eaters, veggies, meats, whole foods.
So yeah, the real argument, which I don't think Dr. Joel comments on much at all, is healthy diet versus vegan diet. Dr. Joel's constantly, it's kind of like a straw man argument. He's taking the absolute worst diet that includes meat and then putting that against a vegan diet.
When Chris Kresser talks specifically about context, he mentions, he's like, well, meat, I'm not talking about processed meat. Processed is different from whole meat. Dr. Joel Kahn is like, no, well, they're basically the same. He basically says meat and processed, it's all meat.
Yeah.
He uses the phrasing, it's all meat.
Yeah, this is kind of where you have to question what the motives are, because it is slightly a religious movement for sure. All is fair in love and war, that type of thing, where like you're going to bend the facts a little bit to get less people to eat meat because you have, it's such a cause to you, like anything is okay to get people to stop eating meat. Where like if you watch the film What the Health, it's kind of a lot of the same stuff. Like everything is talking about hot dogs and chicken nuggets from McDonald's. It's not talking about a healthy diet.
It's not talking about whole foods.
There's some good fats, like omega-3 fatty acids are essential. You have to have them. And then maybe polyunsaturated fats from plants are more healthful. But
very interesting that he says omega-3 fatty acids are essential because they don't exist in plant form other than in algae. And I assume he's talking about DHA because that's the one that actually matters. We'll get to this towards the end, or actually I think in part 2, but the supplementation necessary to maintain a healthy vegan diet is pretty extreme.
Whether it's the World Health Organization, the American Heart Association, American College of Cardiology, whether it's the Institute of Medicine says eat as little saturated fat as possible. They couldn't be more clear, and these are highbrow. These are not associated with vegan movements or paleo movements or whatever. These are medical authorities. If there was half and half, you'd say controversy. 21 to 21 say the same thing. They might pick a different cutoff point, but we will enhance the health and cut down the number one killer, whether it's in Asia, whether it's in Europe, whether it's Australia, whether it's in the United States. There's unanimity.
This reoccurs. I only have it in the video one time, but he says this maybe 10 times, appealing to authority. Like, we couldn't have gotten it wrong. All of these organizations say eat as little saturated fat as possible. They used to say eat as little cholesterol as possible. They no longer say that, kind of indicating that progress is possible. Like, they were wrong. Now they corrected the cholesterol thing. It's just funny when you look at the data because we're super fat now. And we've been following, like, not everyone follows the guidelines, but when the guidelines say a certain thing, more people follow it. So like when the guidelines say low fat, our fat intake for the past 50 years has gone way down and we're fatter than ever. Yeah, it's just an appeal to authority.
Then they did controlled trials. Everybody just go read Clark, 1997, 395, it's called metabolic studies. Change the diet, see what happens. You add saturated fat, cholesterol skyrockets on average, not in a single person. If I gave you a steak, Chris a steak, and me a steak, our cholesterol would rise differently. It would rise differently. It's our microbiome, it's our genetics, it would rise. So
I looked into this, and you have to actually do some digging to get the full study, but it does show if you replace 10% of calories from saturated fat and you put it to 10% complex carbs, or if you put it to polyunsaturated fats, the cholesterol is lowered. I don't really have an answer to that. I think the study is pretty valid. Small dietary changes can change your cholesterol numbers. The only thing is the study was 1 month.
So they tested their cholesterol every single day for a month?
No, it's a meta-analysis. So it's 395 different studies. They do a collection of all of it and they analyze it. The median study was 1 month. It's pretty consistently showing that it will raise your cholesterol, but I'm wondering like how much that normalizes after the first month, because when you make a dietary change, usually there's an acute change in some blood markers and stuff. So I don't necessarily know that that's a terrible thing. I don't really have an answer for that.
The LDL increased?
Yeah. 80% of the increase was in LDL, 20% in HDL.
Newer studies, I think what you're saying, Chris Kresser talks about, really show no correlation of dietary cholesterol linked to heart disease.
20% of every blockage in a heart is cholesterol. It's a fact that was discovered in 1910. It's never varied. Then we fed animal...
Let's pause for a second.
yeah.
Chris, you have something to say about that?
Yeah, so that doesn't mean that the cholesterol is there because people were eating it, Joel. You know that.
It could be, though.
And,
But hold on.
Let's look at what the research says again here. So they've done controlled feeding studies where they've fed people 2 to 4 eggs a day. And those show that in 75% of cases, that has zero impact on blood cholesterol levels.
So this is an example of where like Dr. Joel's ride or die with the dietary guidelines and like the FDA and everything when it suits him. But then he just references like, you know, he's pulling out cholesterol from arteries, but the guidelines change. They don't recommend to limit cholesterol whatsoever anymore. So he's still like kind of defending that even though the data doesn't support it and the authorities now don't support it either. So it's just like a logical inconsistency.
The sources of saturated fat in the American diet, 33% comes from pizza, desserts, candy, potato chips, pasta, tortillas, burritos, and tacos. 24.5% is unaccounted for, but most likely processed foods, according to the authors. And then 10% is, or almost 10%, sausages, hot dogs, bacon, ribs, and burgers. So the vast majority of saturated, 13% is chicken and mixed chicken dishes. Think KFC or chicken nuggets.
So this is why you can't really get accurate data on like the saturated fat correlate with heart disease.
Right.
Because it's not necessarily saturated fat, because people that are eating more saturated fat, as you can see, 60+% of it is coming from things that are breaded, sugary, deep fried in soybean oil, etc.
Right.
So you can't separate that unless you're looking at like one of the newer studies that Chris Kresser is mentioning that's like the healthy shopper studies. So I think those are a decent metric to look at as far as like a healthy diet that includes lots of saturated fat. And I think like in the next few years we'll probably have more because there'll be keto diet studies. low carb dieter studies that are eating healthy diets. Saturated fat, a lot of times over the past 50 years or so, is just a good marker for a bad diet. Right. So people generally aren't eating good sources of saturated fat.
That's why it's easy to find a correlation.
Yeah.
Quality and context are huge. What kind of foods are we talking about? Because processed doesn't mean whole meats. And then what's the context? Like, who are the individuals we're portraying in these studies? Most of the time, Joel Kahn's talking about standard Americans. Chris Kresser isn't when he's comparing the healthy shoppers in those studies.
Okay, guys, I think that is part one. We're going to have part two. It's probably live right now, so you can check that out too. What do they get into? So in part two, they get into like mechanistic data, why it's not always the most reliable. That's actually really interesting because you would think if there's like a proposed mechanism why something in your body happens based on what you're eating, that would be like the pinnacle. But actually, Chris Kresser does a decent job and opened my eyes to why maybe that's not the case.
And then my favorite part, nutrient density, and why that's huge.
Yeah, and they talk about the carnivore diet. They both give opinions on that. Pretty interesting. So check out part two. I'll link it below.
And don't forget to comment below and let us know what you found interesting of both arguments and sides.